You won't believe what happened when the humble farmer's daughter came face to face with the prestigious principal who looked down on her only to have her mother arrive with a surprise that shook the entire academy. This story is packed with unexpected twists, emotional family moments, and a powerful lesson about not underestimating anyone based on their background. If you love stories about ordinary people stepping up, proving their worth, and inspiring change, stick around because this one will keep you on the edge of your seat. By the end, hearts and minds are transformed, and you won't want to miss how everything comes full circle. So grab a comfortable seat, press play, and get ready for a roller coaster of emotions and triumph. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt, thought-provoking tales. Hitting that subscribe button helps us bring you more stories that entertain, motivate, and spark positive change. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next. Ethan Weston stood on his farmhouse porch just before dawn, gazing out at the fields he'd tended for over 40 years. At 65, he still rose before sunrise to feed the animals, check on his crops, and walk the perimeter of the land passed down through generations of Westons. A tall man with silvering hair and calloused hands, Ethan carried himself with the unhurried confidence of someone deeply connected to the earth. Behind him, the old wooden screen door creaked open, and his 15-year-old daughter, Grace Weston, stepped outside, slim and sharp-eyed. Grace had the curiosity of youth and the grit inherited from a long line of farmers. She gently rested a hand on her father's shoulder, and he turned, smiling at the sight of her dressed neatly in a modest blouse and skirt, the nicest clothes she owned. This morning was different from most. Instead of a day dedicated to weeding, watering, or prepping for harvest, Ethan and Grace planned to drive out to Coldwater Preparatory Academy, an elite private school an hour away. Grace's junior high science teacher had submitted her name to a prestigious competition, and she'd won statewide recognition for her agricultural research project on sustainable pest control. Her teacher insisted that Grace apply to Coldwater Prep, claiming she had the academic record and test scores to merit a scholarship. Ethan had hesitated at first. He was fiercely proud of Grace, but unsure how they would handle the costs, or whether his daughter would fit in with children from wealthy families. Yet Grace had worked hard, not just academically, but on the farm as well, demonstrating both brilliance and responsibility. The morning air smelled of freshly cut hay, and a light summer mist clung to the rolling hills. Within the old farmhouse's kitchen, its faded walls adorned with family photos dating back decades, Ethan had laid out a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and bacon. Usually, they shared a quiet meal before tackling the day's chores, but today's energy was different. Grace was polite but noticeably restless. She couldn't stop glancing at a worn, leather-bound portfolio lying on the table, containing her recommendation letters, certificates, and the final version of her scholarship essay. Despite her outward confidence, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the folder's edges. From one of the walls hung a photo of Ethan's late wife, Elizabeth Beth Chow Weston, known to some in a different life as Dr. Elizabeth Chow, a brilliant agricultural scientist whose groundbreaking research once made headlines. Most folks in their rural community only remembered Beth as the smart city woman Ethan had brought home decades ago. She'd stepped away from the public eye to start a family, but her influence remained in every corner of this farmhouse. Old books on crop genetics and environmental engineering lined the shelves. Faded newspaper clippings about her early breakthroughs were carefully tucked away in a filing cabinet that Grace sometimes thumbed through. Ethan finished his coffee, caught Grace's eye, and gave her an encouraging nod. Though she'd never seen her mother in a lab coat or giving a speech at some grand conference, Grace still carried that scientific spark in her blood. The radio on the counter played a faint country tune as the father and daughter squared their shoulders, gathered Grace's portfolio, and headed out the door toward their aging pickup truck. The plan was simple: drive to Coldwater Prep, present Grace's qualifications, and hope that someone on the admissions board would see past the dirt roads and modest address on her file. Yet, beneath their optimism, both worried about how a small-town farmer's daughter would be received at a place that prided itself on exclusivity. They had no idea how drastically one meeting would change their lives and the future of the entire school. The pickup truck rattled down the paved highway, a stark contrast to the sleek SUVs and luxury cars that typically ferried students to Coldwater Preparatory Academy. Grace sat in the passenger seat, absently tapping her foot on the floorboard. She gazed out at the scenery, green pastures gradually giving way to well-kept suburban lawns and, eventually, the stately gates of the academy itself. The campus sprawled across manicured grounds, with grand brick buildings and wide walkways lined by meticulously trimmed hedges. A polished bronze sign at the entrance read Coldwater Preparatory Academy, below which was etched the Latin motto, Excellence Through Privilege. Ethan found a visitor parking space near the rear of a lot filled with vehicles that screamed wealth high-end sedans and foreign sports cars with tinted windows. He killed the engine, and for a moment, both father and daughter simply looked through the windshield in silence. All around them, families dressed in expensive attire guided well-coiffed teenagers toward the admissions building. Grace glanced down at her own second-hand skirt and worn flats. She took a deep breath, as if steadying herself for a leap into unfamiliar waters. "Ready?" Honey Ethan asked quietly. His voice held a note of concern. He remembered how excited Grace had been upon receiving her acceptance for an admissions interview, but also how the teacher who recommended her had mentioned, somewhat apologetically, that Coldwater catered to families with deep pockets and influential connections. He reached over and gently squeezed Grace's hand. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." She nodded, swallowing hard, then opened the door. The summer sun felt almost oppressive as they navigated the pristine pathways leading to the admissions building, a modern glass structure that stood in stark contrast to the older architecture on campus. Inside, they were greeted by an immaculate marble floor, towering columns, and a receptionist who looked up from her computer with a polite but distant smile. After Ethan explained they were there for Grace's interview, they were directed to a smaller waiting area lined with chairs upholstered in soft velvet. Framed photographs of Coldwater's famous alumni senators, CEOs, Olympic athletes covered the walls. Grace scanned the faces, recognizing a few from TV or online news. She clutched her portfolio tighter, aware that the competition for admission was fierce. They waited 15 minutes in relative silence, until a lean man in a tailored suit approached with measured steps. "Mr. Weston." "Miss Weston," he asked, extending a hand. "I'm Principal Randall Strickland. Thank you for coming today." Strickland's gaze flicked briefly to Ethan's calloused hands, then to Grace's understated outfit, betraying only the slightest hint of judgment. "Please, follow me to my office." They were led down a corridor hung with academic accolades and framed philanthropic awards testaments to the Academy's storied legacy. At the end of the hallway, they entered a spacious office furnished with mahogany bookshelves and a large antique desk. A massive window behind Strickland's chair overlooked a manicured lawn where uniformed students strolled between classes. The principal gestured for them to sit, his practiced smile never quite reaching his eyes. Grace breathed in, summoning her courage, and opened the portfolio in her lap. Ethan sat beside her, squaring his shoulders protectively. He didn't need to be told that this man viewed them as outsiders. He could feel it in the air, as thick as the morning fog on his fields. Strickland's office smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive leather. Diplomas from Ivy League institutions were displayed on the wall, and each plaque boasted membership in various educational boards. Sitting behind his desk, the principal wasted no time in flipping through Grace's application file. Grace offered him a polite greeting, mentioning her top grades at Maplewood Junior High and the science research project that had garnered a state award. Yet the moment she uttered agricultural research, Strickland's expression seemed to harden, as though the word farm conjured an unspoken barrier of prejudice. "Very interesting," Strickland said, shutting the folder gently. "We do appreciate well-rounded students. I see you've excelled academically. However, our admissions process is highly selective. We get many applicants with robust extracurriculars, from leading debate teams to traveling abroad for cultural exchange programs." His gaze settled on Grace, then flicked to Ethan, his tone edged with condescension. "Your background is distinct. Miss Weston, we don't often see applicants from rural agrarian communities. The question is, can you acclimate to the level of sophistication here at Coldwater? Grace's cheeks burned, but she maintained eye contact. I believe so, sir. My project on sustainable pest control can be scaled to help small farms. If given the right mentorship and resources, I'd like to collaborate with Coldwater's science department. I noticed your website mentions advanced labs. Yes. Strickland cut her off with a dismissive wave. Our labs are quite advanced indeed, but beyond academic credentials, we also consider whether a student will be a good fit for the Coldwater culture. Many of our families are quite involved in philanthropic endeavors and social networking events. They have certain expectations about the circles their children will move in. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing where this was going. He cleared his throat. Mr. Strickland, we understand Coldwater is prestigious, and we're not here looking for charity. We only ask that you see Grace's potential. She's worked day and night, balancing chores on the farm with top academic performance. The principal steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. Potential is important, of course, but I must also evaluate the environment our community fosters. You've indicated a request for scholarship assistance, he paused, allowing the implication to sink in. Our scholarship fund is limited. Priority often goes to legacy families or those who have contributed significantly to the academy. Grace's heart pounded. She thought of the hours she'd spent perfecting her essays, the glowing recommendations from her teachers, and the passion she held for science, none of which seemed to matter in this imposing, wood-paneled office. I'm willing to do any extra work, she stammered, determined not to let nerves silence her. I can handle advanced coursework, and I've even started a separate research project. Strickland raised a hand again. I admire your ambition, Miss Weston, but we must maintain standards suited to our institution's mission. There was a razor-thin smile on his lips as he carefully closed her folder and placed it on his desk. I'm afraid we don't have a place for you at Coldwater Preparatory Academy. Perhaps a public high school closer to home would be more appropriate. Ethan frowned, the sting of rejection sharper than any of the criticisms he'd heard about farming over the years. He thought of his late wife, how proud she would have been of Grace's accomplishments. Grace managed a tiny nod, pushing down tears. She wanted to argue, to present more evidence. But the finality in Strickland's voice stopped her cold. In that moment, she realized it would take more than academic success to overcome the bias embedded in these polished halls. Father and daughter left the office in stunned silence, walking down the corridor past the gallery of Coldwater alumni who had, by virtue of birth and opportunity, never faced such scorn. Outside, the midday sun felt harsher than usual, reflecting off the academy's flawless marble steps. Grace clung to her portfolio, as if it could still serve as her shield. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. We'll figure something out, kiddo. This isn't the only path. They climbed into the old pickup, and Ethan started the engine. The tires crunched on the gravel as they left the immaculate parking lot. Within minutes, the manicured lawns gave way to the wide expanse of countryside, dotted with barns and fields. Grace sat quietly, replaying the interview in her head. She recalled the exact moment Strickland's tone shifted from feigned politeness to outright dismissal. She loathed the way he'd looked at her father's hands, noticing every stain or rough patch. Most of all, she despised how quickly he deemed her unworthy. Despite her academic achievements, the farmland soon replaced the image of Coldwater's imposing buildings. Rolling hills, hay bales, and sturdy fences offered a sense of comfort. As they turned onto the dusty road leading to the Weston homestead, Ethan finally spoke. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Grace, you deserve better. Grace swallowed hard. I was really hoping, I knew it was a long shot, but I thought my grades would at least give me a chance, and Ethan nodded. I know. It's not about your grades. They don't see who you really are, or what you can do. When they pulled up to the farmhouse, Grace hopped out, still trying to collect her thoughts. The porch swing creaked in the breeze, a mundane familiarity that clashed with her swirling emotions. Inside, the old house felt quiet and safe, a sanctuary that always welcomed her with the scent of pine boards and homemade bread. She set her portfolio on the kitchen table and sank into a chair, staring at the photograph of her mother on the shelf. Beth Chow Weston had once been a rising star in agricultural science, but she'd retreated from the limelight when she met Ethan. Grace knew her mother's brilliance had never truly dimmed. It just found a different home in the fields behind their house, in the laughter shared over simple meals, and in the quiet encouragement Beth gave to Grace's earliest science experiments. Ethan placed a gentle hand on his daughter's back. "Why don't you relax a bit? I'll warm up some supper, and we'll talk it through." Grace glanced at her watch. "Isn't Mom's flight coming in tomorrow?" Ethan gave a small grin. "Actually, she texted earlier, said she might be arriving sooner than expected. Something about wrapping up a conference in Geneva ahead of schedule." He shook his head, recalling how Beth had once told him she had no intention of re-entering the public scientific arena. Yet in the past few months, she'd been drawn back by urgent calls from old colleagues global agriculture. Issues needed her expertise. "If she gets in tonight, I know she'll want to hear about what happened at Coldwater." Grace sighed, feeling a twinge of relief. Her mother's presence was a stabilizing force, even if it sometimes came with big surprises. "All right, Dad. Supper sounds good." She paused. "I just hope we can maybe find a way forward. Someplace that values what I can do." He nodded. "We will, Grace. If there's one thing your mother taught me, it's that every field has hidden potential. Sometimes you just have to dig a little deeper to find it." He squeezed her shoulder once more before heading into the kitchen, leaving Grace staring at her mother's photograph, wondering what advice Beth might offer if she were here right now. That evening, a gentle summer breeze carried the sound of crickets through the open windows of the farmhouse. The sun had set, blanketing the fields in a soft twilight. Grace busied herself in her room, flipping through her research notes, trying to distract from the day's disappointment. She reviewed her diagrams on pest-resistant plants and eco-friendly fertilizers, but her mind wandered back to Principal Strickland's aloof expression. Eventually, she closed her binder with a sigh. Downstairs, Ethan prepared a hearty stew of vegetables and chicken. He'd set the table in hopeful anticipation of Beth's return. As he was ladling stew into bowls, headlights swept across the front windows, followed by the rumble of a car engine outside. Grace rushed to the porch just in time to see a taxi pull up. Out stepped her mother, Beth Chow Weston, looking travel-weary yet carrying that distinctive poise that always made Grace proud. Beth's dark hair, streaked lightly with silver at the temples, was pulled back into a simple ponytail. She wore a practical linen blazer and slacks, an outfit that fit both business and the rigors of traveling across continents for conferences. The taxi driver handed her a small suitcase, and she offered him a grateful smile before turning to face her daughter. "Hey, sweet pea," Beth greeted, her voice warm despite the fatigue. Grace wrapped her arms around her mother, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and old books that always clung to Beth's clothes. "Missed you," Grace mumbled, eyes stinging with tears she'd been holding back all day. Beth set her suitcase down on the porch and held Grace at arm's length. "Missed you too," she replied, studying her daughter's expression. "There's something on your mind." Grace nodded, forcing a small smile. "Dad can explain better than I can. It wasn't a great day." Ethan emerged, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He gave his wife a tender hug, pressing a quick kiss to her cheek. "Welcome home," he said softly. Though Ethan was older by several years, the mutual respect and affection in their eyes spoke of a strong bond forged over decades. The three of them gathered around the kitchen table, the warm yellow light illuminating the worn wood surface that bore countless memories of family dinners. Over steaming bowls of stew, Grace began recounting the visit to Coldwater Prep. She kept her voice steady, but the hurt bled through. The mention of Principal Strickland's dismissive remarks made Beth's brow furrow. She asked pointed questions about the application process, the scholarship details, and Strickland's specific words about background and fit. "Sounds like a classic case of prejudice," Beth murmured, tapping her fingers on the table. "I'd hoped private school had evolved, but apparently some remain stuck in old ways." Grace shrugged. "I tried to keep my cool, but it felt like he decided within minutes, maybe seconds, that I wasn't worth their time. Beth's eyes glinted with determination. We might need to have a conversation with them. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Beth, let's not go raising a storm. I know Matt how you can be when you're fired up. We just want to see if Grace can get a fair shot somewhere else. Beth exhaled, her composure returning. I'm not planning on bulldozing anyone, but let's just say I have some contacts who might help us open a dialogue. She paused, studying Grace's troubled face. It's not just about Grace. How many other kids out there are being dismissed because of where they come from? Grace perked up at that. You really think we can change their minds? Beth offered a gentle smile. I don't know, sweet pea. But at the very least, I'd like to show them who they're underestimating. She reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over Grace's. Tomorrow morning, let's see if Principal Strickland is open to a conversation, maybe with a few references of my own. Ethan was about to ask what she meant by references, but the quiet confidence in Beth's tone made him hold back. He recalled the early days of their marriage, when Beth turned around a local bank manager's refusal to grant a loan for new farm equipment. Within a week, not only had Ethan secured the loan, but the manager had personally visited to see the innovative improvements Ethan and Beth were introducing to sustainable farming. All right, he conceded with a nod, but let's try to keep it civil. Beth grinned, though her eyes flashed with resolve. Civil, sure, timid, never. Dawn broke over the Weston farm with a brilliant crimson sky. While Ethan headed out to feed the animals, Beth remained in the farmhouse, making a series of phone calls. Grace could hear her mother's calm, measured voice drifting through the half-open door to the study. She recognized some of the languages, English interspersed with rapid Chinese hinting at Beth's international connections. After an hour, Beth emerged with a satisfied look. We have a meeting, she announced. Principal Strickland seems open to a follow-up discussion, though he sounded reluctant. I also made a few other calls. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Should I go get my portfolio again? Beth nodded. Yes. Bring everything you showed him. This time, we'll make sure he actually reads it. By mid-morning, they were ready, but instead of driving, Beth called up an acquaintance who lived in the region, Mayor Candace Wilkins of Maplewood Township. The two women had crossed paths years ago when the mayor was a young council member pushing for more sustainable farming grants. Within the hour, a dusty black SUV pulled into the Weston driveway, and out stepped Mayor Wilkins, her hair in a neat twist and a determined glint in her eyes. So, we're headed to Coldwater Prep. Are we? The mayor asked, shaking Ethan's hand. I've been wanting to meet with their board about local scholarship opportunities. Might be a good time to bring that up, especially if they're turning away talented students like Grace. Ethan coughed politely. Isn't this too much of a show? Beth gave him a reassuring pat on the arm. We're not making a scene. We're making a statement. There's a difference. Grace swallowed a mixture of nerves and excitement. She climbed into the back seat, hugging her portfolio to her chest. Beth sat up front, exchanging stories with the mayor about various initiatives they'd partnered on: food drives, fundraising events for local schools, and a county-wide sustainability project. Every so often, Beth would drop a name of a professor or an ambassador Grace had never heard of, and the mayor would nod knowingly. It was a world Grace had only glimpsed in passing, but she realized just how far her father's influence reached. When they arrived at Coldwater Prep, the campus bustle was in full swing, parents dropping off kids, a few staff members rushing to meetings, a few heads turned when they recognized Mayor Wilkins stepping out of the SUV with Beth, Ethan, and Grace. This time, Beth wore jeans and hiking boots, still professional in demeanor, but grounded and approachable. She was done with formal airs. Inside the admissions building, the receptionist's eyes widened when she saw the mayor approach. Good morning. Do you have an appointment? Yes, we do, Mayor Wilkins said politely, gesturing to Grace. We're here to meet Principal Strickland. He's expecting us. A phone call later, and they were ushered into the same imposing office as before. Principal Strickland rose from behind his desk, brow furrowed, clearly trying to maintain composure. Mayor Wilkins, Ms. Weston, Mr. Weston, and Grace, this is unexpected. Beth stepped forward, handshake extended, her tone cordial but firm. I appreciate you making time for us. I'm Elizabeth Chow Weston, Grace's mother. I understand there was a bit of a misunderstanding about Grace's qualifications yesterday. Strickland clasped Beth's hand briefly. His eyes flicking between her and the mayor, he cleared his throat. Well, we always strive to give each applicant fair consideration. But as I mentioned to Mr. Weston, our standards. Certainly, Beth interjected smoothly. I'd like to talk about those standards, if that's all right with you. Without waiting for a reply, she settled into one of the leather chairs. Mayor Wilkins following suit, Ethan and Grace stood behind them, quietly observing. As Beth began the conversation that would ultimately shift the entire dynamic of Coldwater Prep's admissions approach. Principal Strickland tried to project authority, but the presence of Mayor Wilkins and the calm confidence radiating from Beth unsettled him. He clasped his hands on the desk, leaning forward slightly. May I offer you coffee, he asked, stalling for a moment. When both women politely declined, he sighed and refocused his attention on Beth. Mrs. Weston, he began. Dr. Weston, she corrected gently, offering him a measured smile. I hold a Ph.D. in agricultural science, though I haven't used the title in a public setting for quite some time. A flicker of surprise passed over Strickland's face. Beth continued. I've spent the last few years quietly working with various international agencies on sustainability initiatives. I've also collaborated with local governments, such as Mayor Wilkins here, to improve educational access for students in rural communities. Strickland cleared his throat. I see. That's admirable work. But about Grace's application, she is academically qualified, Beth stated, top scores, strong recommendations, and an award-winning research project. Yet your immediate response was that she wouldn't fit the culture at Coldwater, which, if I'm not mistaken, is code for saying our family's rural lifestyle is too far removed from what you normally see here. A faint blush crept up Strickland's cheeks. We have certain traditions. Traditions are fine, Mayor Wilkins interjected. But if those traditions lead to excluding bright students who can't flash a family endowment or a fancy address, then that's a problem. And I'm here because I've spoken to others in our county who feel they have been overlooked by Coldwater's scholarship programs. I intended to address these concerns with your board. It seems timely that Dr. Weston and Grace are also here. Grace watched quietly, standing with Ethan at the back of the office. She felt a swirl of gratitude and apprehension. Gratitude that her mother and the mayor were fighting for her. Apprehension about how aggressively they were confronting Strickland. She'd never seen him so rattled, his carefully curated dignity beginning to show cracks. Strickland pursed his lips. I'm not saying Grace isn't capable, but we do have limited scholarship funds, and we often reserve those for families who've supported the academy for years or contributed in other ways. Beth exchanged a glance with Ethan, then turned back to Strickland. I'm not here to demand an immediate scholarship. I'm here to question your evaluation criteria. Grace's background shouldn't disqualify her. It should enrich your community. Her research is exactly the kind of forward-thinking science that your promotional materials claim to value. Mayor Wilkins folded her arms. It's also worth noting that the state is looking at new legislation to encourage private schools to broaden their admissions outreach, especially in counties like ours. Schools that fail to comply may see reductions in certain types of funding or tax incentives. She delivered that statement with the casual tone of someone dropping a subtle bombshell. Strickland's discomfort became palpable. He ran a hand over his neatly parted hair. I wasn't aware those discussions had progressed so far. They have, the mayor said firmly. Silence lingered in the office for a few moments. Finally, Strickland broke it with a measured exhale. All right, let's say we revisit Grace's application. The admissions deadline has passed, but perhaps we can make an exception given her accolades. We'd still need to discuss the financial aspect. I'll pay full tuition, Beth said abruptly. Ethan's eyes widened, and so did Grace's. The principal raised an eyebrow, clearly reassessing his assumptions. Beth continued, "We may not flaunt it, but we're not without resources. However, Shkema, I insist that any scholarship fund available to Grace be reallocated to another deserving student from a rural background, someone whose family can't afford private schooling or who lacks connections." Grace nearly dropped her portfolio in surprise. She had no idea her mother was willing to make such a move. Strickland blinked, as if recalibrating. "That's generous." Beth offered a crisp nod. "I also want to see changes in how you scout and evaluate applicants from agricultural or low-income regions. If you're serious about excellence, you'll find it in more places than your usual pipeline." Strickland pressed his lips together. "We'd need board approval for changes to our admissions policy." "I'd be happy to meet your board," Mayor Wilkins said. Seizing the moment, "We can discuss county initiatives that incentivize broader admissions. Might be beneficial to Coldwater in the long run." Another pause, heavy with possibility. Finally, Strickland managed a constrained smile. "Why don't we schedule something? In the meantime, I'll authorize Grace's reevaluation. If her records are as strong as you claim, we might find a place for her after all." Beth glanced at Grace, her expression a mix of pride and reassurance. The mayor eased back in her seat, clearly satisfied that their presence had made an impact. Ethan, who had stayed quiet through most of the exchange, allowed himself a small smile. For the first time, he believed that Grace's future might hold the opportunities she deserved, though he still sensed this was only the opening round in a larger struggle for fairness and recognition. An hour later, the group reconvened in the hallway outside Strickland's office, the tension finally starting to dissipate. Mayor Wilkins exchanged business cards with the receptionist, reaffirming her intent to speak with the Academy's board. Beth stepped aside to answer a phone call from one of her international colleagues, leaving Ethan and Grace momentarily alone. Grace felt an odd mix of emotions: relief, disbelief, and a lingering sense that everything was happening too quickly. She turned to her father. "Dad, did you know Mom had the means to pay tuition like that? I always assumed we were pretty tight on money. The farm's been our main livelihood." Ethan sighed, looking almost apologetic. "Your mother and I decided early on that we wouldn't flaunt her earnings from her patents and research consultancies. She stepped away from the public eye to focus on our family and the farm, but she never lost the rights to her work. We used some of that money to modernize equipment, keep the farm afloat during rough seasons. I didn't realize she'd be willing to cover Coldwater's full tuition, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised." Grace digested this new information, a swirl of thoughts racing through her head. She knew her mother was brilliant, she just never understood the extent of her influence or financial stability. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the foot traffic of students streaming by. "It was partly Beth's wish. She wanted you to learn the value of work and humility. She didn't want you to think success was handed to you. And truth be told, we never expected to need that money for an elite private school. Our plan was to help you apply for scholarships to a good public university someday. But things changed when you started winning these science accolades." Grace nodded, though a flicker of unease remained. She wasn't sure how she felt about her mother's approach, admirably humble on one hand, but perhaps withholding in ways that made Grace question how well she knew her mother. Before she could dwell on it further, Beth ended her phone call and rejoined them. "We have a lunch invitation," Beth announced, glancing at her phone. "It's from a few old friends who are in town for a sustainability conference. They want to hear about what happened today. They might have suggestions for broadening admissions at schools like Coldwater." Mayor Wilkins, overhearing, grinned. "Count me in. I'd love to pick the brains of anyone who can help rural students. I've got a proposition for countywide outreach that needs funding." Ethan hesitated. "I appreciate all this support, but is it wise to escalate things so fast? We got Strickland to reconsider Grace's admission. Maybe we should take that small victory and let the rest be." Beth studied Ethan carefully. "I understand, but you heard what Strickland said. He'll reconsider Grace, not necessarily fix the bigger issue. I can't ignore the other rural kids facing the same bias. This is about more than our daughter now." A small group of uniformed Coldwater students walked by, casting curious glances. Grace wondered if she might soon be one of them. The idea felt both exhilarating and unsettling. She felt Ethan's conflict, too. Her father had always been a peacekeeper, wary of drawing negative attention or stirring up controversy. Yet Beth, once spurred by injustice, had an unstoppable momentum. In truth, Grace stood between them, torn between the quiet modesty of her father's life and the groundbreaking activism that fueled her mother's passion. "All right," Ethan conceded. "I just want to be sure we don't lose sight of Grace in all this." Beth gave him a reassuring smile. "She's at the center of it. Ethan, she's the reason we're even having these conversations." Then she turned to Grace. "But it's important we know how you feel. If you're overwhelmed, we can dial it back." Grace took a breath, steeling herself. "I'm a little overwhelmed," she admitted. "But I think if we can help other kids too, maybe this is worth it." Mayor Wilkins patted Grace on the shoulder. "That's a strong spirit you've got, and trust me, the world needs it." With that, they headed for the exit, stepping back into the glaring sunlight. The campus around them bustled with well-dressed students heading off to advanced classes and extracurriculars, oblivious to the undercurrents of social change that were beginning to ripple through Coldwater's pristine halls. They ended up at a local restaurant near the academy, a cozy place with exposed brick walls and a farmhouse chic interior that felt more comforting than any formal boardroom. The group included Beth, Ethan, Grace, Mayor Wilkins, and three of Beth's acquaintances, former colleagues from her days in agricultural research, now working in education policy and philanthropic initiatives. They gathered around a large wooden table, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a nearby open kitchen. Introductions flew quickly. There was Dr. Miriam Turner, a sharp-witted professor specializing in rural education development; James Ludlow, a philanthropist who funded scholarships for underrepresented communities; and Sophia Caro, a local entrepreneur who ran a chain of eco-friendly grocery stores and was also on a state education council. Each of them listened intently as Beth recounted Grace's experience at Coldwater Prep, the dismissal, the assumptions, and the near total disregard for her actual achievements. Dr. Turner pursed her lips in disapproval. "That kind of bias is sadly common. Many private institutions claim to be merit-based, but in reality, they lean heavily on legacy admissions and wealthy donors. The real losers are capable students like Grace, who could bring fresh ideas and perspectives." James Ludlow tapped his pen on the table. "I've tried to donate to scholarship programs at some prep schools, but they often attach strings like family legacy or expect the donors to be alumni. If you're not part of their old networks, they're less interested." Sophia Caro chimed in. "We need systemic changes. It's not just about one kid's acceptance. It's about altering how these schools recruit and evaluate students. If they're ignoring rural areas entirely, they're missing out on a huge pool of talent." Grace looked from one adult to another, somewhat astonished that so many people had gathered to discuss the discrimination she'd faced that morning. Mayor Wilkins cleared her throat. "That's exactly what we're looking to do. I've got a meeting with the county council next week. If we can show them how a partnership with institutions like Coldwater could benefit both sides, we might push for countywide outreach programs." Ethan felt a swirl of gratitude and anxiety. He shifted in his seat. "All this is great, but are we sure Coldwater will cooperate?" Strickland only agreed to reevaluate Grace when he saw the mayor walk in. Beth nodded. "True. But once the board sees public opinion shifting and the possibility of losing certain incentives, they might become more flexible." James Ludlow raised a hand. "I could set up a fund specifically for rural students, with an endowment that matches every dollar the academy contributes. If they truly believe in diversity and excellence, they'd accept it." Dr. Turner smiled, eyes bright with enthusiasm. "And I can provide data studies showing how rural students often excel in STEM fields because of their hands-on experiences with real-world problem solving. That kind of evidence is hard to ignore, especially for any academic institution that prides itself on success metrics." Sophia Caro turned to Grace. "Grace, would you be willing to share your research at a public forum? Maybe a local event that invites media coverage. If people hear from you directly, they might realize what Coldwater is missing. Grace hesitated, feeling a flutter in her stomach. Public speaking wasn't exactly in her comfort zone, but the supportive gazes around the table reassured her. I, I could try. I'm not used to big crowds, but if it helps other students in my position, I'll do it. Mayor Wilkins gave a satisfied nod. Then we have a plan in motion. Let's schedule a public event where Grace presents her work. We highlight the potential of rural students, and then see if Coldwater's board is willing to step up or risk looking like they're clinging to old biases. As plates of roasted vegetables and savory soups arrived, the conversation continued, each person offering ideas on how best to challenge Coldwater's entrenched practices. For Grace, the world suddenly felt larger and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. Yet, for the first time since that humiliating meeting with Strickland, she sensed hope, not just for herself, but for countless students like her who simply needed an open door instead of a slammed gate. The next week became a whirlwind of preparations for Grace. Between farm chores and her usual schoolwork, she found herself coordinating with Dr. Turner on how to structure a presentation that explained her sustainable pest control research in accessible, media-friendly language. She also spoke with James Ludlow about the scholarship fund he aimed to establish. He wanted to include her story in a broader marketing campaign to inspire donors to contribute an idea that left her both flattered and anxious. Meanwhile, Beth made calls to the Coldwater Prep Board, introducing them to the potential endowment that could underwrite a new wave of rural scholarships. She used her professional tone clear, persuasive, and unwavering, backed by a resume that included co-authoring UN policy recommendations. Even Ethan, who generally avoided phone calls, found himself on the line with local farmers who had kids in advanced math or science classes, gathering testimonials that might be used to illustrate the talent lying dormant in rural schools. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the Westons hosted an informal meetup in their barn, clearing out hay bales to create makeshift seating. Around a dozen families showed up, each with teenagers or younger children who excelled in various fields: biology, robotics, music, but had never considered applying to an elite private school. Some had simply assumed they'd be dismissed based on their backgrounds. As Grace listened to their stories, she felt a growing conviction that this fight wasn't just about her own ambition. It was about opening doors for every kid who felt overlooked. A couple of days later came the public event at Maple Woods Community Center, an airy, multi-purpose hall with fold-out chairs and a small stage. Grace stood backstage, sweaty palms gripping her note cards. She glanced at Beth, who gave her a confident nod. "You've got this, Gracie," her mother whispered. Mayor Wilkins introduced the event to a modest audience of about 50 people: parents, local educators, a few curious townsfolk, and crucially, a reporter from the regional newspaper and a cameraman from a local TV station. "Thank you all for coming," the mayor began. "We're here to talk about expanding educational opportunities for rural students. Our first speaker is someone who represents the future we stand to lose if we don't address bias in admissions. Please welcome Miss Grace Weston." Stepping to the podium, Grace's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the applause. She took a breath and reminded herself of her mother's advice: "Lead with what you know." So she started by explaining her childhood fascination with bugs, how she'd wander the fields with a magnifying glass, observing how certain insects protected crops by preying on pests. She detailed her experiments testing natural repellents derived from local herbs, which led to her award-winning research. She didn't hide the fact that her family had limited funds or that she often had to balance chores with lab work in the evenings. Instead, she emphasized how these challenges honed her creativity. "I realize that necessity is the mother of invention," Grace said, voice trembling only slightly. "When you don't have fancy equipment or big budgets, you learn to innovate with what you have. That's an advantage, not a weakness. Now imagine how many other kids like me are out there, kids with big ideas, but no access to the kinds of resources or connections that could amplify their brilliance." Her words reverberated through the hall, and by the time she finished, she was met with a standing ovation, albeit from a modest crowd. The local TV cameraman caught it all, and the reporter jotted notes furiously. Beth came on stage to hug Grace, beaming with maternal pride. In the audience, Ethan wiped a tear from his eye, so proud he could scarcely contain himself. Afterward, a Q&A session unfolded. Dr. Turner discussed the correlation between rural upbringing and hands-on problem-solving skills. James Ludlow announced plans for a new scholarship endowment, tentatively called the Weston Rural Scholars Fund, aiming to partner with private academies and public universities. Each statement reinforced the same message: rural communities are brimming with potential, and it was high time that elite institutions recognized it. Word of the event spread faster than expected. The local paper ran a front-page article titled "Farm Girl Takes on Elite School Bias." Accompanied by a photo of Grace at the podium, her earnest expression captured mid-speech. The piece highlighted how a simple scholarship rejection had blossomed into a community-wide movement. The article even mentioned Beth's background as an accomplished agricultural scientist, sparking curiosity about her past works. Meanwhile, the local TV station aired a short segment featuring Grace's presentation, which quickly found its way onto social media. Within days, parents from neighboring counties reached out to Mayor Wilkins, expressing similar frustrations about private schools ignoring rural talent. Teachers emailed Dr. Turner, requesting workshops on how to prepare their students for advanced opportunities. James Ludlow's philanthropic office reported an uptick in inquiries from donors eager to support his proposed scholarship fund, and Beth fielded calls from some of her old colleagues in academia, praising her for standing up to gatekeeping in education. At Coldwater Prep, the Board of Trustees found themselves facing an unexpected wave of public scrutiny. In the past, any minor controversies were handled quietly, behind closed doors, thanks to the school's prominent donors and loyal alumni network. But now, the school's name was being associated with old-fashioned snobbery. Alumni with ties to rural roots began to question the institution's policies. Local politicians nudged board members to reconsider their approach. Principal Strickland, who prided himself on maintaining an immaculate public image, discovered that even a few staff members privately sympathized with Grace. Some of the younger teachers had witnessed her science fair presentations or read about her research. One wrote in an anonymous memo to the board, "We are missing out on exceptional minds by clinging to outdated assumptions." That memo leaked, further escalating tensions. By the second week after Grace's public talk, Strickland received a message summoning him to a board meeting on short notice. He arrived to find several trustees already gathered, including a formidable figure, Betty Harcourt, the board chair, a woman known for her philanthropic ties and straightforward manner. "Randall," Betty began without preamble, "we have a problem. The mayor is planning to address the county council about potential repercussions for private schools that don't diversify at admissions. We also have an offer from this Ludlow fellow to fund scholarships aimed at rural students. It could be a significant financial boon, but the press is painting us as elitist dinosaurs." Strickland smoothed his tie. "I've spoken with Dr. Weston and Mayor Wilkins. We've reopened Grace Weston's application. We're willing to admit her." Betty drummed her fingers on the conference table. "That's a start, but the public is demanding broader changes like formal outreach to rural schools or a scholarship program that doesn't rely on legacy donations. They want to see a genuine shift, not just a token acceptance." Another trustee, a graying businessman named Harold Carter, interjected, "Think of the positive PR if we partner with Ludlow's fund. We'd look progressive, open-minded, and it might attract more philanthropic dollars in the long run." Strickland bristled, loath to appear forced into compliance. "I'm concerned about how this might alter our institutional culture. We can't just open the gates to every applicant. We have to maintain our standards." Betty's eyes narrowed. "We've always prided ourselves on nurturing excellence. If that's truly our motto, we should welcome excellence wherever it's found. Are we not educators, first and foremost?" A pregnant silence filled the room. Strickland felt cornered, but he was too savvy to ignore the board's collective mood. "Fine," he finally said. "I will meet with Ludlow, Dr. Weston, and the mayor to discuss a pilot scholarship program. But I want final say on who gets admitted." Betty nodded. "That's acceptable. For now, But don't underestimate the public sentiment. If we're perceived as dragging our feet, or if we sabotage the program with petty rules, this backlash will intensify. We all stand to lose. Strickland forced a tight smile. I understand. Yet even as he left the boardroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger transformation at Coldwater Prep, one that would either elevate the academy to new heights or shatter the veneer of exclusivity that had defined it for generations. That weekend, Grace and Ethan rose at dawn to harvest a fresh crop of tomatoes, cucumbers, and bell peppers. It was early summer, and the produce glistened with morning dew. They worked in companionable silence, though each had the same question on their mind. What would happen if Grace was admitted to Coldwater? She had grown used to the rhythms of life in Maplewood, where teachers knew every student by name and the farm was just down the road. Was she truly ready to immerse herself in a world of tailored blazers and classical music recitals? Yet Grace also felt a stirring excitement. She pictured the advanced labs, the well-stocked library, the chance to collaborate with other science-driven students who might share her fascination with sustainable agriculture. Maybe she could convince a few classmates to work on pilot projects for the farm, bridging the gap between theory and practice. After the morning's work, Beth joined them at the kitchen table with a new development. I've just spoken with James Ludlow, she said, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. He's finalized plans for the Weston Rural Scholars Fund, named it after our family to honor the impetus that started all this. He's scheduled a meeting with Coldwater's board next week to hash out the details. Grace fiddled with a stray strand of hair, her nerves evident. So, how does that work? Will they pick random kids from rural areas? Beth smiled wryly. We hope not. The idea is to set up a separate admissions track focused on rural talent with a blind evaluation process, no address, no family income details, just academic achievements, recommendations, and personal essays. Only after they decide who passes that stage would they see the financials. That way, bias is minimized. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. It sounds fairer. But is Strickland on board? He's begrudgingly agreeing to pilot the program. Beth replied, don't get me wrong, he's still worried about preserving the culture at Coldwater. But the board sees the PR and financial benefits. That might be enough to sway him. Grace looked down, her voice tinged with hesitation. I keep thinking, do I really want to go to a school that only accepts me because of public pressure, because it makes them look good? Beth reached for her daughter's hand. I understand that concern, honey. But sometimes institutions only change under pressure. And once you're there, you can prove beyond a doubt that you belong. You'll make it easier for the next kid like you. That's how real change happens, one foot in the door. Then keep it open for others. Ethan offered a reassuring nod. We'll support whatever you decide. Grace. She took a breath, remembering how it felt to stand in front of that small crowd, explaining her research. The looks of respect and understanding from educators, policymakers, even the TV journalist, had felt validating in a way she'd never experienced. Maybe going to Coldwater, even if the door was forced open, could be a platform for bigger things. All right, Grace said softly. I'll see where this leads. That afternoon, she and Beth drove to the orchard at the far end of the Weston property. Beth wanted to show Grace a piece of farmland they'd never fully utilized, an area that could be converted into a small-scale demonstration plot, testing new seed varieties. As they walked between rows of apple trees, Beth told stories of her early career, how she'd once spoken at a conference in Europe about gene editing for drought-resistant crops. She explained how public sentiment there was initially hostile, but slowly they changed minds through data and persistence. It was a subtle parallel to Grace's situation. Changing hearts at Coldwater might require the same mix of facts, passion, and unwavering resolve. A week later, the official meeting between the Coldwater Prep Board, James Ludlow, Beth, and Mayor Wilkins took place in the school's stately conference room. Dark mahogany walls bore the portraits of past headmasters, each with solemn expressions and dated suits. Grace wasn't required to attend, so she remained at home finishing her assignments. Ethan, curious but cautious, decided to accompany Beth for moral support. The meeting opened with formalities, introductions, a review of the school's mission statement, and a quick acknowledgement that Coldwater was at a crossroads. Board Chair Betty Harcourt wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. "We want to clarify that we're not simply reacting to media pressure," she said, her tone carefully measured. "We've always sought excellence in all forms, and if that means expanding our admissions framework, so be it." Principal Strickland maintained a calm facade, but anyone paying attention could sense his reluctance. He nodded dutifully as Betty spoke, then added, "We must, however, ensure that our school's standards of academic rigor and cultural fit remain intact. We don't want to bring in students who won't thrive here." James Ludlow smiled politely. "Completely agreed. Principal Strickland, that's precisely why my team and I propose a blind evaluation stage. We believe the best talents will rise to the top without anyone prejudging them by zip code or parental occupation. Then, after we've identified the top candidates, you can assess finances and additional factors. My fund will cover up to 75% of the tuition for each Western Rural Scholar, with Coldwater providing the remaining 25% through existing scholarship resources." One board member, a lawyer named Rochelle Bryce, leaned forward. "And how do we manage oversight? We have limited staff. Reviewing hundreds of applications from rural counties might be overwhelming." Beth interjected gently. "My colleagues at the State University have developed an online portal that could streamline application intake. It's user-friendly and sorts candidates based on academic scores, extracurricular achievements, and essay responses without revealing personal identifiers. The final stage, an in-person or virtual interview, would be the only point at which the interviewers might see who these kids actually are," Mayor Wilkins added. "And if you're worried about cultural fit, you can do structured interviews focused on adaptability and enthusiasm for learning. But I'd argue that the real question is whether Coldwater can adapt to the strengths these students bring." Strickland's brow furrowed at that subtle challenge. "If we proceed, we'd need to cap the number of these rural scholars. Correct, we can't just have an open-ended acceptance." James Ludlow chuckled. "I'm willing to fund up to 20 scholarships in the first year. That's hardly going to overwhelm your campus of over 1,000 students." Betty Harcourt glanced around the table, gauging the temperature of the room. She saw nods from several board members. "It seems to me that this is a reasonable pilot. If it succeeds, we could expand. If not, we revisit the model." All eyes landed on Strickland for the final word. He inhaled sharply, then exhaled. "All right, I'll make it work. But let's be clear once admitted, these students will be held to the same standards as everyone else. No special treatment beyond financial assistance." Beth inclined her head. "That's exactly what we want. Let them prove they belong because they do." The meeting concluded with a sense of guarded optimism. As people shuffled out, Ethan noticed that for all of Strickland's reservations, the wheels of change had started turning, and it didn't look like they would stop anytime soon. Before leaving, Ethan walked up to the principal and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, sincerity in his voice, "for giving Grace and other kids a shot." Strickland shook Ethan's hand, his expression inscrutable. "Let's hope they use it well." By late summer, Coldwater Preparatory Academy announced the Western Rural Scholars Pilot Program, prompting headlines that range from prestigious Academy welcomes rural talent to "Are private schools really changing?" Grace's reevaluation proceeded smoothly. Her impressive academic record and award-winning research left the admissions committee with little choice but to grant her acceptance. In a letter delivered by email and post, Coldwater welcomed Grace Weston as an incoming freshman with full academic standing, referencing the partial scholarship from James Ludlow's fund and Beth's direct payment covering the rest. When Grace first held the acceptance letter in her hands, she felt a complicated swirl of emotions: pride, relief, and a faint sense of bitterness. She couldn't forget the coldness in Strickland's eyes that first day. But maybe that bitterness could fuel her determination to prove she belonged. A small gathering took place at the farm to celebrate. The families who'd attended the barn meetup brought potluck dishes. Mayor Wilkins dropped by with a homemade strawberry pie, congratulating Grace on opening new doors for future generations. James Ludlow even flew in from out of state for the occasion, Though he wore jeans and sneakers to blend in with the rural vibe, Turner beamed at Grace, teasing her about eventually publishing a paper on her pest control research. Amid the revelry, Beth pulled Grace aside into the orchard, where a low wooden bench sat under a sprawling apple tree. The golden afternoon light fell across her mother's face, highlighting the quiet intensity in her eyes. Grace, she began softly, going to Coldwater might be challenging. You'll be surrounded by kids from wealthy backgrounds, some of whom might look down on you. How do you feel about that? Grace took a moment to gather her thoughts, surveying the orchard that symbolized so much of her rural identity. I'm nervous, she admitted, but also excited. I want to see what I can learn there, and what I can teach them, too. I don't plan on hiding where I come from. Let them see the farm girl who won a science award. Beth smiled, her voice tinged with pride. That's my girl. Just remember, you don't owe them anything. You belong there on your own merits. But if you ever feel overwhelmed, come home, the orchard, the fields, they'll always be here, steady and patient. Grace leaned against her mother. Thanks, Mom, for everything. I know I haven't said it enough. Beth kissed the top of Grace's head. You're allowed to say it as often or as little as you want. Just never doubt how proud I am of you. She pulled back, eyes shining. Now, come on, there's cake, and your father's probably telling embarrassing baby stories about you to the guests. They headed back to the crowd, where indeed Ethan was regaling a small group with anecdotes about toddler Grace feeding worms to the family chickens, her early pest control experiments. The party continued until dusk, with fairy lights strung between the barn beams and folks dancing to acoustic guitar tunes. At one point, Grace spotted her father and mother slow dancing among hay bales, both lost in a quiet moment of contentment. She felt a surge of warmth, certain that no matter how high Coldwater's walls were, her roots ran deeper than any building could overshadow. Yet as she lay in bed that night, the realization of what lay ahead tugged at her. She pictured the corridors of Coldwater, the polished shoes of affluent classmates, the instructors with lofty expectations. Tomorrow, she would shop for uniforms. Next week, orientation. Her heart pounded with the thrill and terror of stepping into a realm so different from her own. Somewhere, in the depths of her gut, she vowed to represent her family and her farm with a pride even if it meant rattling the gilded cage of privilege from the inside. The first day of classes at Coldwater Preparatory Academy arrived with the crisp hint of autumn in the air. Grace stood before the mirror in her room, adjusting the collar of her new uniform, a navy blazer, white shirt, and pleated skirt items that felt foreign against her skin. She inhaled and exhaled slowly, recalling Beth's confident voice telling her she had nothing to prove, even though in her heart, Grace felt she had everything to prove. Ethan offered to drive her to campus, though Grace could have taken the academy's bus. The father-daughter duo rode in comfortable silence, passing farmland drenched in the gold of early morning light. Grace stared at the fields, at the silhouettes of cows grazing, and couldn't help thinking she was leaving a piece of herself behind. Yet she also clung to the promise that new vistas of knowledge and possibility awaited her. Arriving at Coldwater, they navigated the student parking lot filled with shiny sedans and SUVs. Dozens of uniformed teenagers milled about, greeting one another with familiarity. Grace felt a pang of intimidation as she stepped onto the paved walkway leading to the main building. She was an outsider here, a test of the school's new scholarship pilot. She nearly faltered, but one glance at Ethan's encouraging smile reminded her of the orchard, the barn, and the people rooting for her. Insane, the hallways bustled with the frenetic energy of a new academic year. Majestic windows let in bright light over polished floors. A few heads turned as Grace passed. She overheard whispers about the farm girl or the rural scholar. She bit her lip but pushed forward, following her schedule toward the auditorium where the opening assembly was to be held. Principal Strickland stood on stage, addressing hundreds of students in neat rows of seats. He spoke of tradition, excellence, and the proud history of Coldwater Prep. Grace wondered if he'd mentioned the new scholarship program. He did, but only briefly, calling it a small expansion of our ongoing commitment to diversity. No mention of her name or the drama from the summer. Still, the nod to the Weston Rural Scholars Pilot was there, and a smattering of polite applause rippled through the crowd. After the assembly, Grace found herself at the science wing, where she was scheduled for an advanced biology class. The lab was immaculate stainless steel counters, microscopes, state-of-the-art equipment. She tentatively chose a workstation near the back, hoping to go unnoticed. But her assigned lab partner turned out to be a well-groomed boy named Bradley Hollingsworth, whose father's name appeared on multiple plaques around the school. Bradley eyed her with cautious curiosity. "You're the new scholarship kid, right? The one who grows corn or something?" Grace pressed her lips into a thin smile. "We grow a bit of everything: vegetables, fruit, hay, you name it. And I'm not just a scholarship kid. My mother actually covers my tuition. The scholarship funds are for other rural students." He blinked, uncertain how to respond. Then their teacher began the lesson, discussing cell biology and upcoming dissection labs. Bradley turned back to Grace. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I just heard rumors. If you ever need help figuring out how things work around here, let me know. My family's been at Coldwater for generations." Grace exhaled, sensing an undercurrent of sincerity in his tone. "Thanks, I might take you up on that. And maybe I can show you a thing or two about real-world biology from the perspective of a working farm." To her relief, Bradley cracked a half-smile, as though the notion intrigued him. Class proceeded, and Grace found her nerves settling. The equipment she'd once only dreamed of using was now at her fingertips. She could hardly wait for the chance to test theories she'd formulated in the field using these advanced tools. After class, she slipped into the hallway, noticing the lively swirl of students rushing to their next period. She caught a glimpse of Principal Strickland guiding a group of prospective parents on a tour, his voice echoing, "At Coldwater, we're always evolving to embrace excellence in every form." Grace allowed herself a fleeting smile, remembering how different that statement sounded from the one he'd greeted her with at their first encounter. Step by step, she was helping to redefine what excellence looked like here. Before heading to her next class, she texted Ethan, first class down. "Not so bad. Love you?" The reply came almost immediately. "Proud of you. Home is always here." Clutching her books, Grace straightened her shoulders and moved through the corridor. If the orchard and the farm were her roots, then Coldwater might be the place where she learned to spread her branches. And perhaps, in time, others like her would join, unafraid to be farmers' daughters, scientists, or anything else they aspired to be, unbound by the old walls that once kept them out. Looking back, this story isn't just about a farmer's daughter in an elite academy. It's a testament to how even one act of courage and one refusal to accept unfair judgments can flip an entire system upside down and plant the seeds of real, lasting progress. From the farm's sunlit fields to the polished corridors of the academy, every character learned the importance of humility, open-mindedness, and resilience in the face of doubt. For me, the most moving part is witnessing how kindness, determination, and simple faith in someone's potential can make a difference far beyond what we ever imagine. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe education should be more inclusive? Have you experienced a moment when someone dismissed you based on appearances? Comment below. Let's keep the conversation going. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe to show your support for uplifting stories that remind us we all have something special to offer the world.